So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session of this year's Research Week. My name is Naomi Visser, and I'll be chairing the session this morning. As you've seen, please make sure that you're muted and your cameras are turned off. If you would like to ask a question, you may do so in the chat box, and one of us will either answer or ask Anthea to answer, either during her presentation or at the end. Now, our presenter this morning is Dr. Anthea Lesch. She's a senior lecturer in the psychology department, where she's been working since 2008. She describes herself as a scholar, an activist, and a qualitative researcher. She was trained in psychology and public health, and her research includes explorations of community engagement processes in biomedical HIV prevention research, street homelessness in urban Cape Town, and the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown on vulnerable and marginalized communities in South Africa. Anthea, we're looking forward to your talk on the qualitative research paradigm and everything you know about qualitative research. I'm sure it's going to be very informative. Over to you.
Thanks, Naomi, and welcome everyone. It feels a bit weird to be talking into a screen. At least before I projected my slides onto the screen, I could see a few faces, but I did see that there are quite a number of participants in the audience. What I'd like you to do, just as we're starting, is to perhaps type in the chat function what capacity you're joining this presentation in. So are you a student? Are you a staff member? Have you done qualitative research before? For what purpose do you think this particular session might be helpful to you? It'll just help me in terms of, if you can type that, it just helps me in terms of animating who is in the audience and in terms of thinking about the context in which I am presenting this set of guidelines to you on qualitative research. As Naomi said, I'm a qualitative researcher. I work in psychology. My specific focus areas are on community health research, and I'm specifically interested in the impact of inequality, social inequality on health and well-being, and how that shapes the well-being of individuals and communities and the levels of access that they have to resources. So I've been working with qualitative research for more than 20 years, and there is a wealth of information available about qualitative research and how to do qualitative research. And yet, whenever we encounter as novices or we set out on the journey of doing qualitative research, it seems insurmountable, it seems overwhelming, and it seems like often students will tell me, well, there's nothing that seems very clear about how you go about doing qualitative research. This is not strictly true, but it does mean that we must have a certain familiarity about the process that underpins qualitative research. So what I've decided to do today is to provide you with some theoretical content, so just a few ideas about the theoretical underpinnings of qualitative research to set us up and to provide the foundation for you in terms of thinking about the place in which to stand when you do qualitative research, because qualitative research doesn't start from the assumption that you are a neutral observer who's going to uncover an objective reality. In fact, it is the opposite. Qualitative research allows us to take into account the messiness of reality, requires us to embed our research within the particular social setting or context in which we are going to be conducting our research, and requires us to bring all of ourselves into the research process and to be mindful of how we bring ourselves to the research process. So what I'll do today is I'll introduce you briefly to the qualitative research paradigm. I'll talk you through a few key features of the qualitative research approach. We'll briefly discuss the role of the researcher in the qualitative research process, because as the researcher, you are fundamental to not only the design and the execution of the research process, but also the analysis of the data and ultimately the write-up of that data. And I'll share with you some ideas about doing qualitative research. So what is the process that we undertake, and what are the methodological decisions that we have to make when we undertake qualitative research? And then we'll spend some time addressing your questions about doing qualitative research. So the schedule says that can I just finish this last point, Naomi?
Okay.
The schedule says that we will spend 2 hours together. I think 2 hours is simply too much in terms of content and the form that we are using. If we were together in the same room, 2 hours would be more appropriate. So what we'll do is I will speak for about an hour. And as I said, you are welcome to direct questions to Naomi and Kirshner, and they will then inform me what your questions are. But also then at the end, we can spend half an hour just focusing on your questions. Okay, Naomi, I'm ready.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to make sure, do you want a response from the audience now, or do you just want it for your records for afterwards?
No, I'd like it now. Have people started typing in already?
Yes, we have quite
okay, so can you give me an overview of what you're seeing?
Yes, we've got honours students, MSc, quite a number of PhD students, postdocs. We have academic staff. There's someone from nursing and midwifery, someone from engineering, potential PhD student, staff member with clinical trial background, little experience with qualitative research.
Okay.
So quite a variety that we have here.
And what are people saying about the experience and exposure to qualitative research?
They don't say much, except I think one said that he or she was just figuring out what as they went along.
Yes, that sounds absolutely right. Figuring it out as you go along.
Yeah.
Every research process is like that, and qualitative research is more like that. And so often what we find is that people tend to judge the quality of qualitative research, and the critiques and criticisms will come that it is unscientific, which is it's not true. Qualitative research has a very rigorous set of methodological steps that need to be followed, and quality control built into the process. But the main thing that qualitative research does, that quantitative research does not, is that it accepts reality as it presents itself to us, and invites us into that reality to, with the participants in our research, try to make sense of what we are seeing around the particular phenomenon that we want to examine. So I'll start then. I see that we have a range of different levels of students and staff members in the audience, so that gives us a great variety. And I'm assuming that everybody's here because they are in some shape or form embarking on a qualitative research project. So before we begin talking specifically about qualitative research, I want to talk just briefly about the research process. Now, many of you will have started engaging in the research process, and the research process fundamentally starts with our ideas. It starts with, what are the issues that I am interested in exploring in the particular field that I am working? So it comes out of our interests, our beliefs, our curiosities, our observations. And And all of these we bring together, and many of you, particularly graduate students who will have met with their supervisors for the first time, those first meetings are often about what are your research ideas? What are the ideas that you want to explore, and how can we transform those ideas into researchable research questions? So it starts with ideas that are anchored in our experiences, our observations, our curiosities. And the next step then is to transform those ideas, or to think about how to transform those ideas into a research question, a researchable research question. And so we ask ourselves, what research approach then in the next step will allow me to generate the kind of data that I need to answer my research question? So if my question is about differences between groups, so what are the differences? Are there differences between how honors students and master students approach qualitative research? I might think about setting up a questionnaire in which I'll administer to honors students and master students, and then from that I will pull out or be able to draw out differences in levels of understanding, if my interest is in the theoretical aspects, and so on. But if I want to understand how different levels of postgraduate students consider, how do they think about qualitative research and the appropriateness of qualitative research, and how they use it in their own work, then I might want to have a more open design, like qualitative research, in which I begin to engage with people to unpack the understanding of qualitative research from their own perspective. So what I'm trying to illustrate is that whatever research approach we choose must be aligned with our research question. And it starts with developing our research question and then asking ourselves, what kind of data would I need in order to answer my question? So our research approach then is also aligned with our own assumptions, our theoretical assumptions, our philosophical assumptions, that we have developed and crafted through our engagement with a specific field that we're working in, the existing knowledge that we have, and the reasons that we have for doing our research. So if I want to talk about the way in which this has influenced my own research interests, is I don't think of myself as necessarily a researcher. I think of myself as a storyteller. And so with every research project that I undertake, my interest is in how am I going to go about telling the story about this particular phenomenon as it impacts the group of people who are most impacted by it. And so because that is the foundation from which I do my work, I often find that the qualitative approach is the most suitable, because when I think about what kind of data am I going to need to answer my question, I inevitably end up with, well, the kind of data that I'm going to need will be generated through conversation with the particular group of people who are affected by the problem, either individually or in a group. The particular kind of data that I'll need can be generated through visual evidence, through photographs, through existing data that's available in the public domain, through, for example, news reports. And so inevitably, my approach is always a qualitative one, because I want to understand the world as it appears to the individuals who are experiencing the particular issue that I am concerned with. So for example, when the COVID lockdown started, my particular interest became, how are different groups in our society experiencing the lockdown? What are the particular parameters of the experience? What are the particular dynamics of their experience, and how does that shape their risk of becoming infected with COVID-19? And what resources do they have available to protect themselves from becoming infected with COVID-19? So when is qualitative research best then? It's when we want to explore people's perceptions, their experiences, their practices, their life histories, their beliefs, their views, and the interactions within the social context in which they find themselves embedded. It's the best approach to use when we want to understand social phenomena and the social, cultural, and political context in which they take place. And when we want to make sense of these phenomena by exploring them through the lens of the insider. Now, what does this mean? It means that when we undertake qualitative research and we're interested in a particular phenomenon, we're interested in what does this phenomenon mean? How does it occur? How is it experienced by the particular individuals who are embedded in it? The particular individuals who are experiencing this particular phenomenon. So if my research interest is in exploring the impact of poverty on mental health and well-being, I'm going to be guided to community environments, to low-income community environments where people experience material poverty, to find out from them what is your experience of material poverty in this particular environment that you live in, and how does that impact the way in which you are able to engage with the world. How does it impact your physical health? How does it impact your mental health? And what other reverberating impacts does it have on your life? Are there any questions at this stage, Naomi?
No, Anthea. I don't see any.
Okay, thank you. So as Starks and Trinidad says, qualitative research methods enable health sciences researchers to delve into questions of meaning, to examine institutional and social practices and processes, to identify barriers and facilitators to change, and to discover the reasons for the success or failure of interventions. So fundamentally, qualitative research allows us to drill down to the core or the essence of a particular phenomenon, to think about how is this phenomenon experienced by the individuals who are central to it? What meaning do they make of the experiences? What are the social practices and the processes and the dynamics that operate in this particular setting and that contribute to these experiences and the way in which individuals derive meaning? And what are the reasons for these particular experiences? So if I am implementing an intervention, why is my intervention successful or why does it fail? The only way I can understand that is to go to the source, so to go to the participants of my intervention, to go to the targets of my intervention. And so fundamentally, with qualitative research, what we're most interested in is how do people make meaning of their experiences. So qualitative research then is an inductive process. And it's an iterative process. So this reminds me of what one of the participants said earlier. It is figuring it out as it goes along. So it's a systematic process of engaging in the research process and creating the process as we go along, so that it's tailored to the setting and the participants and the issue that we are researching. So what does it mean to do when we say that qualitative research is inductive? It means that we make specific observations through our engagement with the phenomena and the individuals who are participating in our study, and we draw general conclusions about the phenomena based on those observations. So we are engaging in essence in, as I said, meaning making. Another way to think about it is we're engaging in theory making. We're making a theory about how a particular phenomenon manifests in a particular social setting in which there are interactions between different stakeholders. So the iterative component of this is that we are engaging in a series of steps in the research process that we repeat and we adjust and we tweak and we improve and we adapt to the particular problem or the research issue that we are investigating. And so we are creating the research process as we engage in it. How this is different from quantitative research is that with quantitative research, all of the research design decisions, the research instruments, the research approach, the cookbook of how we are going to do research is developed at the proposal stage. And when we go into the data collection phase, we are simply implementing those steps. With qualitative research, we are also documenting our research methodology and making decisions about which particular approaches we're going to take and how we're going to execute our research. But it's a more open process in that often when we go into the field, we find that decisions that we made before we entered the field are no longer relevant and we have to make adjustments. So the iterative nature of the process means that the process is constantly being created as we go throughout the research process. It also means that we have to engage in very careful planning when we develop our research proposal, and make sure that we have a very good understanding of a theoretical understanding of the phenomenon we want to investigate and the setting in which we will be conducting the research. One of the most important features of qualitative research is that the researcher is the primary research instrument. So what do we mean by this? We mean that the researcher is central to the research process because the researcher is the first point of contact. The researcher is responsible for designing the research process, but the researcher is also the primary tool through which the data is collected and analyzed. So if you had a quantitative research study, your research instrument would be a questionnaire or a survey that you would administer, and the data would be analyzed through a statistical package. With qualitative research, the researcher is the data collection instrument. So you might have, and I'll show you an example later, you will have an interview guide that contains a number of questions that you will pose to your research participant. But the quality of the information that you gather or the data that you gather is dependent on how you pose those questions. The data will then be transcribed, and the primary research and the primary analytic instrument will be the researcher. So again, you are responsible for collecting and analyzing the data and making sense of what the data reveals about the phenomenon that you're investigating from the perspective of the research participants. So the research process then is a process of active engagement between the researcher and his or her participants and the research setting. And it's a site for the co-construction of knowledge and understanding of the phenomenon being investigated. So whatever knowledge is produced about the phenomenon is produced through the interaction between the researcher and his or her participants, and the meaning that is created through that interaction. So qualitative research is a partnership. The researcher is embedded in the research process. So in contrast to quantitative research, where the researcher stands often outside of the research process, in qualitative research, the researcher is in partnership and collaboration with his or her participants, with the goal of creating a narrative or a storyline or a thick description of the phenomenon of interest. Now, this notion of a thick description was developed by or adapted by Geertz in 1973. Geertz was an anthropologist. And really what this means is that with qualitative research, we're telling a story and we create that story through words, and our words describe in detail the setting in which we've collected our data, the features of that setting, the interactions that happen in that setting, the rituals and practices that govern that setting, the role players. So who participates in this setting? Who are the different groups of people who participate in the setting, and how do they interact with one another? So this is what's referred to by Geertz as the thick description that forms the foundation of the foundation and the product of qualitative research. Now, often when people embark on qualitative research, I often see in research proposals or in the way in which research reports, qualitative research reports are written up, I see in the rationale section, researchers refer to the rationale for their qualitative research approach as giving voice to participants. And I always find this quite a peculiar way of thinking about what we are doing when we are engaging in qualitative research. Because qualitative research is political. As I've said, it comes out of our own interests, our beliefs, our curiosities, our concerns for the way in which we see certain groups in society being treated and impacted. And so this notion of giving voice ties in with that political agenda. And as qualitative researchers, when we find ourselves tempted to talk about giving voice to participants, we have to think about the power that we assume for ourselves when we use terminology like this. So we have to think very carefully about how we present ourselves in the research context and our intentions in the research context. And when we encounter this, I think that, one of my favorite writers is Arundhati Roy. And she has this to say about this issue, this notion of giving voice. She says, there is really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And I think this is very powerful and quite meaningful to me, particularly because when we talk about giving voice to people, we are coming from a place in which we assume that people have no agency and that people don't know how to speak for themselves. And I can tell you this with absolute certainty out of all of my years of conducting qualitative research, is that people have agency. The most vulnerable and marginalized groups of society have agency. They have access to strengths and resources, even if those strengths and resources are not material. And they have things to say. The only role that we have as qualitative researchers is to create the space in which those voices can be heard. So create the space in which that people can speak into in a way that their stories can be heard beyond their settings, that their realities can be expressed and heard and shared, so that we can raise consciousness, we can raise awareness about the particular realities that vulnerable and marginalized groups within society are confronted with. So I'd like to hear from you, just in the chat function, some ideas about how you think about giving voice to the voiceless.
Anthea?
Yes.
Can I interrupt?
Go ahead.
We have two questions. You can say if you want to answer them now or later. Can I give them to you?
Go ahead.
The first one is from a lecturer, I assume. Is all qualitative research necessarily inductive in nature? She refers to the economic and management sciences students who mostly, or the research they do is mostly deductive in nature, but they often employ qualitative research methods.
Okay.
And then there's a second question, can qualitative research also be deductive and abductive?
Sure. So by its very nature, if we think about the philosophical underpinnings of qualitative research, the intention is for it to be inductive, that true qualitative research is inductive. And so when I use the term true qualitative research, I'm not using it in a way to be judgmental about what is and what isn't qualitative research. I'm only using it to say that when we engage in research and practice, we often use techniques and we borrow techniques from different approaches in order to do our research, because every single research project presents us with a unique context that we're working in, or unique problem that we're working with. And our main goal as researchers is to find the methodological approach that provides us with the best fit for answering the research question. But where qualitative research can be deductive is simply in terms of how we think of the theoretical framing of the research, and how we conduct the analysis of the research. So what does that mean? It means that sometimes we conduct qualitative research where the research is led by existing theory or by existing research findings in the field, and we're not interested in exploring anything outside of those particular issues. We're interested in collecting data that helps us to strengthen our theoretical position, or that provides us with more evidence of the way in which a particular phenomenon manifests. So in that sense, we are interested. We've narrowed down our interest or our focus in terms of what we are interested in the context of our research. So that is the sense in which we can think of qualitative research as deductive. Another way in which we can think of qualitative research as deductive is in the analysis process. So what again does this mean? It means that when we are conducting the analysis of our data, so now we've got our text and we want to analyze our text. Again, we decide which approach we're going to take to analyzing our data. So the most commonly used qualitative research technique is thematic analysis. And within thematic analysis, we can choose whether we want to adopt an inductive and a deductive approach. And our decision, again, will be based on what is the intention of our research, what is our research question, and what is it particularly that we're interested in this particular phenomenon. If we were to adopt a deductive approach, what we would be doing is creating a framework for analyzing our data ahead of the analysis. So we might there might be a specific theory that we are using as the lens through which to view our phenomenon, and this theory might have particular components, and so we would use those components as the foundation of our analysis. And we would, in essence, look through in our analysis process, we would try to fit the findings to the theoretical framework. So how are these particular aspects of the theoretical framework represented in our data set? So those are the two senses in which we can think of qualitative research as deductive, but fundamentally qualitative research is exploratory. And so the intention is that it is an inductive process in which we work from the ground up. We create the phenomenon from the ground up, from within our embeddedness within that setting, and engaging with the research participants. But that doesn't mean that taking another approach is less relevant. Relevance is decided by the question that guides our research. And in practice, we often marry various techniques from various disciplines or various methodologies in order to execute our research. And the key when we do that is to explain why we are doing what we are doing. So to provide a theoretically sound rationale for why we've chosen to adopt a particular way of approaching our research. So I hope that answers that question. Are there any comments on the notion of giving voice to the voiceless?
There's just one, no, more coming in. On the question of giving voice, for my topic, it's more to explore if a specific phenomenon is being applied. And then another one, I've never thought of qualitative research as giving voice to the voiceless, but I have discovered and realized that perspective and context are the drivers for me at the moment. Who you are and your environment are going to influence your opinions and views, and until the one has not stood in the other's shoes, it's very difficult to point fingers or make any judgment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So it's all about remaining curious and recognizing that when you enter the research world, from a qualitative perspective, you are a traveler to another country. So you are a tourist, and you need to behave like a tourist, being curious about what you see and about the things that people tell you, and remaining constantly aware of what is happening in that setting. So when we start off with our qualitative research process, we've now we've transformed, we've had our research idea, we've transformed our idea into a research question, and now we need to think about which approach within qualitative research would best suit our research question. So there are a number of approaches that we can choose from, and the ones I'm presenting to you are not necessarily exhaustive. These are just a few that I thought I would mention. The most important thing for you to do is to think about which of these approaches are appropriate or would be appropriate to guide my research. And if none of these are appropriate, to continue reading. I provide you with a long list of qualitative research texts at the end of the slide presentation. So I'll share the slide presentation with all of you at the end. So first, we can locate our research in a phenomenological approach, and phenomenology is essentially interested in lived experiences. So the lived experiences and descriptions from the perspective of the research participants and their embodied perception of how a particular phenomenon impacts their lives. So here we might think of, I had a student who's just completed her master's degree who was very interested in looking at street homelessness. And the aspect of street homelessness that she was interested in is she wanted to know, how is it experienced? How do people who live on the streets experience living on the streets? How do they make sense of it? How do they make sense of it? How do they make meaning of this choice that they have made? And when I use the word choice, I also use it cautiously because, you know, often people are you know, making a choice is a relative experience when you are vulnerable, when you are from a vulnerable and marginalized group. And so her approach to her research was phenomenology, because her main interest was in hearing people tell their stories about what living on the streets is like for them from day to day. We can also use a discourse analytic approach. So here we think about, our focus is on language and how language is used in a particular setting, and how the use of language functions and operates to accomplish personal, social, and political goals through language. So what are the power dynamics that are established through the way in which we use language, and how does language construct reality, or the realities that individuals experience? And even within discourse analysis, there are a number of different approaches that we can use. So if that is your particular interest, you can read up more about the various ways in which you can conduct a discourse analysis. The narrative approach emphasizes life stories. So it asks people to tell us about their lives often in an autobiographical fashion. And they can tell these stories to us through various methodologies. So we can conduct interviews with people. So we can have written stories, we can have spoken word stories, we can have visual representations, or we can have a mixture of all of these techniques that we can use to work with our participants to uncover their life stories. And so what's important here is often to think about who are my research participants and what technique must I use, would be most effective for me to use in order to get these participants to tell me their life stories. Often, people are not practiced in the written word. They're more practiced in the spoken word, so they can tell us their stories, in an interview context. Often, people are not practiced in really describing their realities and their feelings and their emotions. And in such instances, we can use visual representations as the foundation for the storytelling. So we could, for example, have people create art, or we can have people take pictures, or we can have people bring pictures, and then we can use those as the foundation for our interviews. So there are many ways one can be quite creative in terms of how one collects one's data. Grounded theory approach is also a very specific approach that we can use, and the grounded theory has the ultimate goal of developing an explanatory theory. So grounded theory follows a set methodology, set procedures, set steps that guides us through the whole research process, from developing the research question, to the sampling, to the data collection and analysis, with the ultimate goal of developing a local theory, or a theory that's embedded within the local context, that describes the way in which the dynamics of that context operates. And so we study people embedded within their social context, and we try to develop a theory of the way in which basic social processes in that environment operates. Ethnography is something that I think many of you will have heard of. This is an in-depth engagement with a research setting in which our aim is to gain a holistic view of a sociocultural group by studying how they enact their culture. So what do people do? How do people talk? What do they say? How do they use language? What are the rituals and practices? And what are the artifacts that they utilize in their particular setting? And again, there are a number of ways in which you can do this, and a number of ways in which the researcher can conduct the observation that forms the foundation of the ethnography. A number of positions that the researcher can occupy. So you can be an observer, or you can be a full participant in the setting. And obviously each of these positions that you can occupy will have its own dynamics and its own difficulties to grapple with. And then we can also adopt a case study approach, which is an in-depth study of a bounded system or case. Here we make a decision about a setting in which we will find the particular phenomenon that we're interested in, and we study that particular setting or case as the focus of our research. So this is often used in organizational research, where we want to work out. So for example, if we're interested in the experiences of people who work in a particular organization with transformation, with organizational transformation, then we would use a case study approach in which we would focus on that particular organization, and we would speak to various stakeholder groups within the organization and use different kinds of data in order to construct our case. So we might use interviews, we might use focus groups, we might use documentary evidence to construct the overall story that tells the story of this particular case that we're working with in relation to the phenomenon that we're working with. So once we've selected our theoretical approach, so are we going to adopt a phenomenological approach, a narrative approach, an ethnographical approach? We can also adopt, I don't know how many of you have heard of an approach called autoethnography, which is conducting an ethnography of your own life experience. So once we've made that decision, everything else, like with research, once you've decided which paradigm your research falls in, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, once you've developed your research question, it really becomes much like a decision tree, because your research question will determine whether your research is qualitative or quantitative. And once you've made the decision about qualitative research, again, the particular interest that you have, the way that you framed your research question will tell you whether it is a narrative study, a phenomenological study, whether it's a grounded theory study, whether it's a discourse analytic study, and so on. And from there, again, each of these methods have aligned with them particular data collection methods. So in qualitative research, we work with text, we work with words, and we can also work with visual data. So the text might be generated specifically for the study. So we might conduct interviews with individuals, which is the most common way, is to conduct interviews or to conduct focus groups, which is a group interview. But we might also use text that's already available in the public domain. So we might, there might be, so for example, if I was interested in thinking about the impact of displacement on people who were displaced from District 6, for example, the District 6 Museum has an archive of interviews and records, and all sorts of data sources that I could use to construct my data set. As I said in my earlier example, if I'm interested in thinking about what the impact of COVID-19 has been on vulnerable and marginalized groups in society, I could easily look at news reports. I could look at news reports in the form of both written reports, but also in the form of news reports on television. It's easy to work with those these days because they're all available to us via YouTube, and so I could use that as the foundation of my analysis. Or I could work with visual data, or I could use a combination of these two. And so with visual data, some techniques is a technique called photo voice, where we ask people to take pictures and then come and talk to us about their pictures. And this is, it's referred to as an emancipatory and a liberatory technique because it brings us right into the center of the reality of participants, and it can serve as a consciousness-raising exercise because often at the photo voice studies have as one of their dissemination techniques an exhibition of people's stories. So I've provided a list there of different kinds of techniques that can be used to generate data that we can use as the foundation of our qualitative research. So we can use dialogues, interviews, focus group discussions. We can use observations, but participant observation in particular settings. We can use visual techniques like photo voice, which I've just mentioned, and body mapping and drawings. We can use writing, so we can ask our participants to write diaries, or write reflexive logs so if we want to look at particular experiences, how people experience a particular phenomenon. So let's say my interest is in how yoga promotes health and well-being in a group of people who have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. I might ask them to write a log of the experience after each yoga class that forms part of the intervention, and I might use that as part of my data set. We can also ask people to write stories, and we can use those. And then we can perform documentary analysis. So as I've just referred, we can use media reports, or we can use institutional reports, and we can use all of these in combination with each other as a way of constructing a holistic image of the phenomenon that we want. And the techniques that we use will depend on the questions that we have. It's very important in qualitative research to make sure that you collect demographic data about your participants. So it's important to have, even whenever you go into the setting to collect data, it's important to take a form with you, a demographic information form that contains, information that's of relevance to your study. So what's of relevance to all of our studies would be to know the age of our participants, their gender, maybe how they identify by race. For some studies, it might be important to know what their level of household income is. It might be we might want to know what kind of housing they live in. We might want to know what level of education they have. And all of these pieces of information will help us to construct our participants when we write up our research report. Now, Wumi, are there any questions at this stage?
Yes, I have questions about the approach. There's a question of, could you use both phenomenology? Sorry, I thought I was going to struggle.
I hear you. I hear what you're trying to say.
The phenomenological and a narrative approach. Can you use both, as there seems to be a fine line between them?
I would say that the theoretical approaches are distinct. So once you use one, you should stick with it, and you would choose the one that is most appropriate for your research. But again, you might want to adapt an approach particularly for your own research. So if you say that you think there's a fine line between phenomenological analysis, a phenomenological approach and a narrative approach, then you would have to explain why you think there is this fine line and what it is about your particular problem and the way in which you want to approach it that requires you to adopt both of these approaches. In general, one would adopt either one of the approaches.
Okay. Now, the same student asks if there's a limit to the number of approaches, but you've actually answered.
No, in general, you would choose one approach, and you would choose the approach that aligns most closely with the question that you have. And what I want to suggest is that, because these are each quite distinct approaches, and once you've chosen an approach, it has implications for how you collect your data, how you go about sampling, how you go about analyzing your data. So the most important thing to consider is to think about fit, the fit between your research question and the approach that you choose. And these two must be in alignment. And how you make a decision is by immersing yourself in reading about these approaches, about the different approaches that you're interested in. And that will help you to make a decision. Familiarize yourself with phenomenology and, what it is, how it's done, what it's intended to do, and narrative, what it is, how it's done, and what it's intended to do. Because one of the key differences between phenomenology and narrative is that narrative is often autobiographical. It says, tell me your life story, whereas phenomenology says, tell me what your experience is of living on the streets. And so there is a difference between those, a theoretical difference between those two different things.
Okay, and then just one more question. If an online survey asks qualitative questions and asks, for example, for the most significant change stories,
yes,
is it a quantitative tool or a qualitative one?
That's a qualitative one. So anytime you have a question that asks for an open-ended response, and that's actually quite a great question. Thanks for bringing that up, because it just cautions, it just helps me to remember something that I didn't mention, is that we have, what's happened with COVID is that everything goes online. So now, how do you conduct qualitative research when you can't meet with your research participants? And so using techniques like that, where you ask people to write stories on, you create a space where people can write stories, or where people can write their responses or respond to certain triggers, or you do telephone interviews, or you do Skype interviews. I've got lots of students who transitioned onto doing Skype interviews or Zoom interviews. And so, yes, that is the data that is generated is text. And so you would use qualitative techniques to analyze the text. But I think what the student who posed that question, what they're referring to is a mixed method approach, which I haven't focused much on. So mixed method is where you would use both quantitative and qualitative techniques in your study for various purposes, to achieve various goals. Sorry, I catch myself waiting for a response, and then I realize I'm not going to get one because we're all in different places. So that's thanks for bringing that up. There are various ways in which we can generate the text, and that is a particular example of how you would use a qualitative approach. And qualitative data collection and data analytic techniques as part of a questionnaire. And often that's often what is done in health research context is you would have a standard questionnaire or a standard survey instrument, and at the end of the instrument you might put 3 or 4 open-ended questions for people to respond to, that you will then analyze using thematic analysis. Generally. Okay, can I continue? So,
sorry, Anthea,
yes.
There's just one more question. Yes, someone who wants more information about the mixed method approach. Are you going to get to that?
No, I think that if someone wants to read about the mixed method approach, they can. It's something that's sort of quite substantially documented. So I would suggest that they do a search. And I'm not sure if I have any references on mixed method approaches, but I would suggest that they go and read up on that.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So moving on now to thinking about how to collect your data. There are various methods available to us for collecting our data, and essentially in qualitative research, the most common way of collecting data is to conduct interviews. So you conduct interviews with people who will be able to tell you about this particular phenomenon that you're interested in, this issue that you're interested in. An interview is a conversation with a purpose, and it's led by the researcher. So it means that the researcher has to be incredibly well prepared, be familiar with all the literature, the available literature in the area on this phenomena that tells us the different ways in which it manifests and how it impacts the people who are experiencing it, so that we can have a productive conversation. So the interview can be as open-ended or as closed-ended as you want to, but in most qualitative research, we use semi-structured interviews. And simply what this means is that we set up an interview schedule that has 3 or 4 questions with a few probes that we use as the guiding framework for our interview. So the interview is a social interaction, and it's an interaction between you as the researcher and the participant. And so the researcher's function in the interview process is to create a safe space in which a participant can share their experiences and can tell us about how they make sense of the experiences. So the researcher will frame the boundaries and provide the framework for the discussion. And it's always very important to think about what the power imbalances in that conversation might be. So as researchers, we are university educated individuals with particular privileges that come with that. And if we go into settings where we're interviewing people from vulnerable and marginalized groups, we have to think about the impact that we will have on the impact that we will have on the research setting, and the impact that the way in which we present ourselves will have on the way in which the participant will engage with us. So it's very important to think about how you prepare yourself as an individual for that process. So, a lot of my data collection has happened in the context of community clinics, and particularly research clinics in townships. And, part of what I did as getting myself into the setting and understanding the setting so that I would be able to interact with my research participants in an appropriate manner was to look at the way in which people dress, to look at the way in which people interact, and to try and not stand out in that setting. So what I would do is I would always arrive and a half an hour before my interview was scheduled and just sit in the waiting room and sit in the waiting room of the clinic before my appointment started and just observe and look at how people were using space, how people were interacting with each other. And all of that gives one very valuable cues as to how to engage with the research participants. So that's a layer of preparation that's very important that often isn't discussed. Another data collection method that is incredibly powerful is the focus group discussion method. Now, a focus group discussion is a small group interview, so you'd have between 6 and 12 people on a focus topic. So you'd have your focus question. So similar to an interview, you have an interview guide in which you have 2 or 3 questions that you want to ask. And the data that you generate is produced through the social interaction between the different participants in the group. So basically how it works in practice is that you have your question, you introduce yourself, you introduce what you're going to, what you're interested in, and you would ask your first question, and the group would begin to discuss that amongst themselves. Now, being a researcher in a focus group is a very interesting place to be because you're inside the group, but also outside of the group. So you're a participant, but you're also an observer, in that your only goal is to facilitate the conversation. It's not to insert your ideas and your views into the conversation. It's not to manage the conversation. It is to bring the conversation back to the relevant topic or the topic of interest if it goes off tangent. But it is simply about managing, and it's almost a bit like directing traffic when you do a focus group, because the power of the social group, of the focus group, lies in the interactions between the people in the group and what that generates in terms of the common understanding of this idea that you're asking them to talk about. So participants in focus groups co-construct their ideas, their views and their opinions and their perceptions of the phenomenon. That is how they think and feel about the topic being discussed. And you'll find that they'll often contest each other's interpretations. There'll be contradictions. They'll agree, or they'll. So the common understanding is one that's negotiated. So one of the seminal writers on focus groups is Kitzinger and Barber, and they say that in focus groups, the research participants create an audience for one another. It's important to note how they articulate, contest, oppose, agree, or change their opinions, and how this relates to peer communication and group norms. So focus groups require quite a lot of preparation and quite a lot of internal preparation for the facilitator. And they're quite hard to keep track of in terms of the data collection, in terms of documenting them. And so I always suggest that if you're going to use focus groups, that you get a moderator, so someone who comes with you, who draws a map of the room and where participants sit, and can document, the different ways in which people are talking to each other. And there's a whole focus group kit in the library, in the university library, that if this is a method that you're interested in, that will guide you through exactly how to set it up and how to make it work for you. But it's an incredibly, incredibly powerful method. And so it's one that I've often used, because, there are just things that are generated through the power of group and people interacting with one another that you could never access through an individual interview. Selecting your participants. Your participants are as important incredibly important, because you want to select people who we refer to as key informants. So people who have first-hand experience of the phenomenon that you're interested in, people who've experienced it firsthand, or sometimes people who have observed it. So what do I mean by that? So sometimes it's not possible to talk to the person who's experienced it, because for whatever reasons, often for ethical reasons, but often it's not possible to talk to that person because that person perhaps might not be able to articulate, or doesn't have the capacity to articulate the experience. And so you would go to someone who is related to that person. So this can be in the case of where you are working with someone who has a particular psychiatric disorder, or, one of my students is doing research on the autism spectrum disorder, and wanting to know how families cope. So she's not speaking to the children, but rather to the parents. And so it's important, again, to think about who is the real key informant, who is the person who I need to speak to, who is the person, or who are the people who I need to speak to in order to be able to gather the kind of data that I need to understand and illuminate this phenomenon. It might be that you need to speak to both the parents and the children, if that's possible. It depends on how this phenomenon manifests and who are the people who are central to the way in which it's experienced or the way in which it manifests. And you would make your decision based on that. And so there are various sampling strategies that we use in qualitative research. So purpose of sampling is one of the most commonly used strategies. And it simply means that we are going to find the people who have first-hand experience of the phenomenon, and we call them, key informants. And so, so that's purpose of sampling. Snowball sampling is where we might find a phenomenon that we want to explore, but it's very difficult to sample individuals from that community. So, for example, I have a student who wants to research the coming out stories of colored men in rural communities. Now, that's a very difficult sample to access. So his sampling strategy involves multiple things. So first, what he's going to do is he's going to place some adverts on Facebook groups. And then once he has got he's going to also try and sample through his own networks. But then also what he's going to do is, once he has his first research participant, he's going to ask that research participant whether they know of anyone else who might qualify and be interested in participating in his research study. So that's what we call snowball sampling, or it's also referred to as referral sampling. I have another student who has done his research on colored girls' experiences of transitioning to natural hair, so the meaning of hair in colored communities. And he also used snowball sampling. So it's particularly helpful for issues where you know that it's going to be difficult to sample, to find participants to participate in your study. And then deviant sampling is simply as it says, you know, sometimes we want to find, where we're interested in not finding the common manifestation of the case, but we want to find the deviant manifestation of the case. And you can read up on all of those techniques and more in the research textbooks. The important thing when you're selecting participants is to be very clear about what your inclusion criteria are and what your exclusion criteria are. So who qualifies to be included and who is excluded by virtue of them not meeting certain criteria. So obviously, if you're doing a study that is focused on women's experiences of gender-based violence, one of your exclusion criteria is going to be males. And that's just a simple example, but it's to think very carefully about what are your inclusion and what are your exclusion criteria. And these things that I'm mentioning to you that you need to think about are quite important for your research ethics application, because they want to see that you've thought through and that you can document all of these decisions that you've made. The next step, and you know, I'm presenting these issues as if they are steps that follow on each other, but qualitative research is not a linear process. You know, you are working on all of these things simultaneously often. So don't see them as steps that follow sequentially, see them more as elements that form part of the process. So I've mentioned the interview guide a little bit before. The interview guide is a guide in which the researcher outlines the questions that they'll cover. The questions are open-ended, so please make sure that the way in which you frame your questions allow them to be answered with a response that is not yes or no. Because when you have a response that's yes or no, that closes down the discussion. So you want open-ended questions, and your questions are grounded in your research question and the aims of your study. So when you're developing your interview guide, go back to your research question and the aims of your study and develop 3 or 4 questions. That's enough. That's what you'll be able to cover in an hour. 3 or 4 questions that are central to what you want to ask, and have a few probes under each question. I'll show you what an interview guide looks like in a minute. And the reason why this is important is because an interview guide is just that. A semi-structured interview uses an interview guide to guide the conversation. The purpose of your interview is not to get through the questions on your interview guide. The purpose of your interview is to have a conversation with a purpose, a conversation with the participant about the particular phenomenon that you're interested in order to generate the data that you need to answer your question. So the guide is there simply to guide you, and often you'll find that, you know, you'll ask the first question and the participant will start talking, and through your engagement with the participant, you probably won't need to ask all the questions because they'll tell you all of what you need to know in an organic manner. But the guide is there for you to make sure that you get all the relevant information from each participant. So sometimes you may need to ask all the questions, and other times you won't need to, because the participant will already have told you the answer to, you know, their response to question 3 when they started with question 1. So again, when you interview, think of it as a logical flow of conversation. You start with basic information gathering questions about themselves, and just getting to know them, setting them at ease, creating the parameters, and then you move to more specific questions where you tap into their opinions and their experiences, etc. And as I said, you include probes so that, you know, you can ask follow-up questions and you can elaborate and verify the information that you've gathered. So as I said, the interview guide is not a script to be followed. It's simply a guideline of the information required from the research participant so that you have consistency across your various interviews. That's very important for quality control purposes, and that you build depth in the phenomenon that you want to investigate. So you clarify, you verify, and you ask for further explanation. You must consider the time that you have available. I served on the Research Ethics Committee for 5 or 6 years, and I read a lot of research proposals and I read a lot of research reports. And I'm often surprised when people tell me that they're going to conduct interviews for 30 to 45 minutes. That's generally not enough time. If you think about the relationship that you have to build with a participant in order to get good quality data. So my suggestion is that generally 60 minutes for an individual interview and 90 minutes for a focus group, and work with that time. And then always to be prepared to conduct a pilot interview using your interview guide. So interview a friend just to see whether the questions that you're asking work and whether they give you the kind of data and responses that you thought they would generate, and then you can make adjustments. And I've mentioned the biographical information questionnaire. So this is an example of an interview guide that we used in a study on type 2 diabetes, in which we were interested in finding out, people's experiences of living with type 2 diabetes, and how they cope. So you'll see we start with, general information type questions. Tell me about yourself, tell me about your family, tell me when were you diagnosed and how did you experience that, how did you feel, how long have you been living with type 2 diabetes, and then we dig into the more specific. Now tell me about what is it like to live with type 2 diabetes. And you'll see the probes underneath are directed towards asking more refined questions if the participant is not able to articulate their experience in a more general manner. So that's an example. And yeah, as I said, now when you conduct the interview, I want to build on this idea that we started that I introduced you to at the start. It's a co-construction of knowledge between the interviewer and the participant, and the quality of the evidence that you will gather depends on your own level of preparation and your skill in putting the participant at ease and in accessing their ability to articulate the experience to you. So Kwala, who has written some seminal work on interviewing and qualitative research, which I would recommend you all read if you're interested in doing qualitative research and using interviews, calls the interview the construction site of knowledge. It's the site in which knowledge about the phenomenon is generated and excavated. So you really need to be, as an interviewer, well prepared, sharp, have worked on your interviewing skills, and focus on being present with the participant rather than asking questions of the participant. So there's a distinction between those two things, right? The interview isn't about asking questions, it's about having a conversation. So you need to be able to guide the conversation, to facilitate the dialogue, and to build rapport, to use basic skills like empathy and compassion to build that rapport and to facilitate dialogue and to create the conditions that participants feel safe in, that they can share their world and what they know about that world and how they make sense of that world with you. And then most importantly, all your interviews must be recorded. If you don't have a recording, you don't have data. And that's fundamentally what it is. So often we find that, and I think I mention this later again, often we find that participants will say, because you have to ask a participant's permission to record their interview. And sometimes we find that participants will say they don't want to be audio recorded, and then you have to respect that, and thank them for their time, but you can't continue with the interview. So what are the qualities of a good interviewer? It's someone who's knowledgeable about their research area, someone who's fully present, that listens well and observes body language and movement and is able to be engaged in the process. An interviewer is someone who's curious, because as researchers, that's fundamentally why we're doing the research. We're curious. We want to understand a particular phenomenon that we don't understand. And we're now engaging with someone who's an insider who can help us understand this phenomenon more fully. And so we must be curious and have an inquiring stance and know how to express that to our participant, to show them that we're interested in what they have to say and that we think that what they have to say is important. So it goes without saying that a good interviewer is non-judgmental, and if we remain curious, it becomes easier to be non-judgmental, because remember, you have to bracket yourself in order to give space to the participant. You also want to use techniques that allow you to remain with the participant, and that allows you to deepen the level of, or the depth of, the information that you get from the participant. So at certain junctures, you want to paraphrase what the participant has said to make sure that you have understood correctly what they are communicating, and reflect that back to the participant so they can then say to you, no, that's not actually what I meant, and that's not actually what I said, this is what I said. If someone just says, you have to listen actively so that you can figure out where there are places in the interview where the participant is not telling you all that there is to tell. And then you can go back and you can probe and you can say, earlier on you told me X, Y, Z. And I wondered if you can tell me more about that, because we didn't get to talk about that fully. Just use something like that. If you are conducting interviews in which there are language issues and you're using a translator, you have to include the translator in the process, and you have to have conversations with your translator ahead of time about how the interview scenario will be constructed, so that they are very clear about what their goal is in the process and what their role is in the process. Reaching data saturation, this is where we now think about what is the appropriate sample size. So in general, with qualitative research, there are various documents and people have written about how you decide on a sample size. And so when we write our research proposal, in contrast to when you're doing quantitative research, you are not really able to say specifically how many people you will form part of your sample, but you are able to make an estimation. So often we'll say the research will recruit 15 to 20 people to participate in this research, and we'll continue to collect data until we reach data saturation. Now, what does data saturation mean? It simply means that the point at which we are no longer seeing new ideas emerging through our interviews. So once we reach a point where with each successive interview, participants are telling us the same general stories or the same general themes are recurring, then we know that we have now reached data saturation point and we can stop with our interviews. So analyzing the data then is important. The preparation is important. The data will be the transcriptions of your interviews or focus group discussions. It would be your photographs, videos that you've made, etc. And again, the choice of an analytic technique will depend on the approach that you choose. So if you have chosen a phenomenological analysis, you would use IPA, interpretive phenomenological analysis. Thematic analysis is a general kind of qualitative research strategy that's quite popular and quite simple to do, and that many people use, and that fits with many of the approaches. So, thematic analysis can be inductive or it can be deductive. So it can be focused on creating a theory from the data, or it can be focused on imposing a theoretical framework or a set of ideas that is already existing onto the data. Grounded theory is a very specific methodology that has a very specific way of analyzing your data, and you can read up on that. And then narrative analysis will have its own analytic technique. The tools that you will use to assist you in the analysis process to manage the data, because qualitative research generates hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of text. And you will need a way to manage that. The one that I like to use is called Atlas TI, and I think the university has actually just bought a license for it, because otherwise you can also get a student license. In Vivo, I don't know anything about, but it's also quite popular and it's available for free. And then, I've had students who simply choose to use Excel. So they analyze their data, they do their coding in Word, and then they transfer the codes and the quotes to Excel, and they do that. So there are many ways, and the way that you choose will be the way that's most convenient for you. The important thing to remember is to use pseudonyms when you're reporting your data to ensure the confidentiality of your participants. So that goes without saying. Sometimes quite a nice icebreaker technique when you have a focus group, or even when you have an interview, is to ask your participant to choose a pseudonym that they'd like you to use when you write up your research results. So what in essence is analyzing your data? It's a simple process in which you decontextualize the data. So you separate it from its original context, from the context of the transcript. And you do this by assigning codes to your data, and these codes represent units of meaning. And then you begin to look for patterns and themes in the data, and you reintegrate that data. So you organize and reduce the data around themes and draw relationships between themes. So it's really about transforming your data into text, applying your chosen analytic framework, verifying your findings and reporting your findings, and remembering that the process is not linear or sequential. So again, we return to Kufala's co-construction site of knowledge. That's essentially what you're generating through your analysis. You're creating your text for analysis through your transcript. You want to get a rich, full description of participants' experiences, and your transcription is creating a verbatim record of the audio recording. I would suggest that all novice researchers do their own transcriptions, because it offers you a way of getting into your data that is invaluable, and that doesn't happen when you are simply asking someone to do the transcription for you. Transcriptions will have to be translated into the language that you will analyze it in, if that's an issue. And it's very important to verify your transcriptions and your translations. So to simply listen to the transcription, listen to the recording, and alongside the transcription to make sure that the transcription is accurate. As I said, the research is the instrument for the analysis, so you familiarize yourself with the data, which means simply reading through the data, making notes, making memos, ideas that you want to follow up on, questions that you have as you're reading through the data. Then you apply your analytic framework using your software, your Excel or your Atlas TI. Sometimes you start by working by hand. So you print out your transcript and then you code by hand, but then you still have to find a way to document that electronically, so that it makes it easier for you to manage and integrate amongst the multiple transcripts that you're analyzing. And through that process, you begin to generate themes. So some studies will develop a code book of different codes that you, with descriptions that you will then use. So you develop the code book this generally works well when you're working on a team. So 2 or 3 members of the team will analyze 3 or 4 transcripts, come up with some codes, and then they'll have a discussion about the codes that they developed and the descriptions that they have for those codes to come to an agreement of a list of codes that they can use to analyze the data. And so then you have the code book, and you can go on to analyze the other transcripts using the code book. But it's important to remember that the code book will constantly be evolving, because as you go through the rest of the transcripts, you might find new themes or new ideas that you will then have to add to the code book. So here are things we often hear students when they write. I will analyze my study data using thematic analysis. Themes emerge from the data. So, themes don't emerge from the data. The themes emerge through our interpretation of the data. So it's important to think about how you write up your process. Because thematic analysis, for example, as Braun and Clark says, can be a method which works both to reflect reality and to unpick or unravel the surface of reality. So it all depends on our interpretive framework and the theory that's guiding us and our own beliefs and values and what we bring to the process. And so when we start to analyze our data, we need to be aware that themes don't simply emerge from the data, they emerge through our interpretation of the data. Generating themes requires a number of steps. I've spoken about bottom-up and top-down approach to identifying themes. And Braun and Clark, if you're going to do thematic analysis, is one of the most accessible and simple ways of proceeding. It's very well explained. Their seminal 2006 article is a very good resource. And they take you through 6 phases of thematic analysis that starts with familiarizing yourself with the data, reading it through it, making notes, generating initial codes, searching for themes, then reviewing those themes, then thinking about how you're going to define and name those themes, and then finally you produce a report. So verifying your analysis is a participatory process, and this is where quality control becomes quite important. It's about ensuring the trustworthiness and authenticity of your data and your analysis. In quantitative research, we talk about validity and reliability. In qualitative research, we talk about trustworthiness and authenticity. And there's a number of techniques that we can use in order to ensure the trustworthiness and the authenticity of our data and our analysis. So the first is important, and it relates to the researcher's role in the research. It's called researcher reflexivity. And it means that we have to ongoingly consider how we might impact the research, the data collection, and the analysis. There are a number of ways in which we can do this reflection. We can have conversations with our colleagues and with our mentors. We can write memos that look at how our thoughts and ideas evolve. And I would suggest to anyone undertaking qualitative research that they keep a research journal in which they can document their ideas and thoughts, etc. So as an example, every time I finish a data collection activity, like an interview or a focus group or whatever it is, as I leave the setting, I have my tape recorder with me, and I speak into the tape recorder as I drive away. What were my thoughts? How did I feel that day? How did I experience the space? How did I experience the setting? How do I make sense of some things that happened? What are things that I want to remind myself to pick up on for next interviews, or to dig through in terms of my own understanding of what was said? And those sorts of things. And I find that that's quite a helpful way of doing it, because often by the time you get home, qualitative research collecting data is very exhausting. And it just means that you add another activity by the time you get home. So it's nice to use that time in the car to reflect. So reflexivity then means critically reflecting on the knowledge that we produce and our role in producing that knowledge. And we can distinguish between functional and personal reflexivity, where functional reflexivity refers to in which ways do I think the research instruments, so my research tools and the processes that I followed, can have impacted the research data, the research setting, the relationship with the participants. And then personal reflexivity, in which ways do I think that myself, everything that I bring with myself, my beliefs, my positioning, my subjectivities, in which ways do I think those aspects will have influenced the research process. Another technique that we can use for trustworthiness and authenticity is peer review. So working with an expert in your data, in your area, to discuss your own interpretation of your data. And here, generally, if you're a student, this would be your supervisor who you would work with to present your analysis and your interpretation and present the data to see whether the conclusions that you're drawing are sound. You can do member checking, which some colleagues of mine, this is a technique that they often use, is once you've done your analysis and you've done your transcriptions, you meet with your participants to verify their account and to check the accuracy of their data, and also to check with them whether the final description of the findings that you've produced aligns with what aligns with the experiences. And then we can also use triangulation, which is using various sources of data or various perspectives to generate a holistic picture of the phenomenon being investigated. So, for example, you might use interviews and focus groups and have multiple individuals involved in the analysis of the data to just build the holistic picture of what you're sitting with. When you report your findings, you've got to decide on a visual format or a thematic map. Now, the thematic map can be as simple as a table that outlines your themes and your sub-themes, that when the reader looks at it, they have a general overview of what your main themes have been and what you found. You choose illustrative quotes from your participant transcripts for each theme. So choose the quotes. It's often very difficult to choose quotes because we feel like there's so many quotes that beautifully describe what we're talking about or represent the theme under which they're being presented. And so this can be quite a difficult process, but you choose 2 or 3 quotes for each theme, depending on how much space you have. And then it's about writing the story or the narrative that you want to tell about, what this phenomenon that you're investigating, how it's been illuminated by the research participants. So it's about making meaning, so integrating your findings with the available literature and the theoretical framework that you've chosen. You bring these 3 aspects together. The findings in the form of the themes that you've generated and the available research evidence that speaks to some of the issues that you want to talk about, or that have come up in your research and your theoretical framework that you're using, and you integrate these in order to generate the story or write the narrative about that represents your findings. In order to do this, it's also a practice, so it's something that you kind of have to practice to get into. And I would suggest that all of you read qualitative research. Like there are lots of qualitative research theses available via Sun Scholar. You can read those to just give us, because people have different conventions and ways of presenting information. And then you can, once you read that and you read journal articles that report on qualitative studies, you can decide on a way that works best for you, that you think most effectively represents the findings of your research. I've just got a few practical hints and tips for interviewing that I always think is helpful, because these are things that you kind of develop and learn along the way. So always arrive early. Make sure that you are settled in and that you get familiar with your surroundings. If you've got a translator, make sure that you brief them about the process that you're going to follow and decide on what their role will be. Will they simply be translating, or will you also be working? Will they be asking some of the questions? and how that process of interaction will work, because it can get quite complicated to work with a translator. Keep a research journal to write notes throughout the process, and especially after your interview. So you don't want to be sitting and taking notes while you're doing the interview, but you do want to be writing down particular aspects that trigger thoughts that you have. So just little, one worders. Have a good knowledge of your research area. Always bring along spare batteries for your recorder and an extra audio recorder. And remember that a cell phone recorder is not the most reliable device to use for audio recording. So get an actual audio recorder and maybe use your cell phone as a backup, and always make sure that your cell phone is charged then. If the participant doesn't want the interview to be recorded, I would strongly suggest that you consider cancelling the interview, because it changes the whole dynamic if you are having to write, if you think you can write down what the participant is saying. Because what you're doing when you're writing down what the participant is saying is already making a decision, already interpreting what is being said, and filtering the participant's words, because there's no way that you're going to be able to write verbatim what was said. And if you don't have a transcript, then you don't have data. And if you're focused on writing down what the participant is saying, you're not present in the interview with the participant. So under those circumstances, it's always better to cancel the interview and thank the participant for their time. Conduct all your interviews in a comfortable and noise-free space. This is particularly important if you are doing a focus group. Often with focus groups, you offer people something to eat. So you bring snacks or something like that. And I've learned the hard way that you have to choose snacks that are noise-free. So no packets of crisps or, cans that make a noise when you open them. Just make the environment as comfortable and as effective as possible. And as I've said, a minimum amount of 60 minutes, and then always be prepared for your interviews, which goes without saying. So I feel like that's been a lot to process and take in. But I hope that gives you an idea of the foundations of qualitative research and what makes it different from quantitative research, the important role that the researcher plays in the process, and then also some sense of what is the process of qualitative research. How would I go about doing qualitative research, and the steps that you would follow and the phases of the process. To set you up to start your journey in qualitative research. And I think one of the most important things often is the resources that one is provided with. So I've provided you with some references of seminal work in qualitative research, or seminal writers and textbooks in the qualitative research area that covers all of these issues that I've been talking about today. And that also covers the different approaches. So like from narrative approach to phenomenology. I don't think I have many resources here on discourse analysis, but that's easily found. The article by Tong in the list here is a 2007 article that talks about how you report qualitative research. And it has a very important checklist that guides you through how to report your qualitative research so that it's comprehensive, so that you are telling the reader everything that they need to know, that reviewers and examiners will look for in a qualitative research report. So with that, I wish you all good luck with your qualitative research process, and I will take a few more questions.
Wow, Anthea, thank you very much. I'm not a researcher, but I found that very interesting and informative, and I'm sure everyone in the audience did too.
Thanks, Naomi. With qualitative research, the most important thing is the work that you will do on yourself.
I can imagine, yes.
Is how you prepare yourself to fulfill the role of the researcher in the qualitative research process.
Yes. I have a few questions here.
Okay.
A practical one about conducting an interview over Zoom or online in any way. Does this place the onus on the participants to have the correct equipment and internet connection?
That's an interesting question. It's quite a tricky one, given, that often we're interviewing people who don't have access to the kinds of resources that we make assumptions about people having. Generally, how you would decide which methodology, which technique you would use. So you could use Zoom. You could use, Zoom is the main one. You could use Skype. You could use it. You could do a telephone interview, or you could do a WhatsApp interview as well. That's also another methodology. So, most people have WhatsApp, and it also gives you the opportunity to record. But the key to making the decision is to actually speak to your participants and see what is the most comfortable for them, what will work most effectively for them. And then, of course, to always make sure that you provide them with a cell phone voucher. So you either provide them with a voucher, a data voucher, or a cell phone voucher, so that it covers the cost of the interview, because the participant shouldn't have to carry the cost of the interview. Does that answer the question?
I'm sure it does. And there's another question about the audio recording. Can you include the issue of audio recording in the informed consent form?
Yes, you do. You should. And so all of you will, when you do when you start writing your research proposals and when you are preparing your documentation for the Research Ethics Committee, will download from the Research Ethics Committee's website the template for the informed consent form. And in there, it's already pre-populated for you the permission to record.
Okay, so sorry, I'm just asking this question now. It's not from one of the participants. So wouldn't the interviewees then have that consent form before the time, or do they sign that when they come to the interview?
It depends. It depends on how you structure your research. Some people will send once they, because it depends on how you structure that part of the process. So there are a number of ways you can go about doing it. So sometimes, some people, what they do is they recruit people. So they'll they recruit someone, and then they'll contact them to describe the research to them and say, okay, this is what my research is about. Would you be interested in participating? And once that person says yes, they will set up the interview. And at the interview, they will, they'll set up the interview at a space that's convenient, or however they're going to do it. And at that interview, they'll deal with the informed consent. Other people will, once they've done the recruitment, once the person says, yes, I'm interested, you send them the informed consent form and you ask them to sign it and read it and sign it and bring it with them to the interview, or send it to you before the interview. So it kind of depends. I only raise the issue about the recording because sometimes I find that students will say, oh no, I'll just do, I'm just going to write down what the participant says. The reality is that there are very few participants who will say that they do not give you permission to record.
Yes, okay, thank you. I think that's about it. Someone says give donuts.
Yes, donuts and muffins and soft foods,
yes.
and not cans and crisp packets, and anything that can rattle and make a noise. You want, and often when you are working with teenagers, for example, you see them sometimes after school. You do the focus groups if you're doing it in a school setting, and then you want to give them something to eat because they've just been in school all day and they're hungry and whatever. But you've got to think about something that's practical and that's not going to disrupt your research process. So that's it. And Naomi, how do I go about sharing these slides with the participants?
I think the best will be for you to send it to me. You do have my email address.
Yes.
And then I will ask Kefner to send it to everyone who attended today or everyone who registered, and he will also make available the recording.
Okay, all right.
That should happen by tomorrow.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. Good luck with your research projects.
Thank you very much, Anthea. I appreciate the time and effort.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.